What were the contributions of Carl Menger, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, and Friedrich von Wieser? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine these three earliest Austrian economists. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's always good to be back with our viewers and listeners, and you too.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice of you to say that. Richard, you ought to go on stage. I think there's one leaving tomorrow. Get it?
Unfortunately, I do.
All right. So, Richard, you were the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College. You were president of the Foundation for Economic Education. You teach economics there at the Citadel. So, I think there's few people that know more about Austrian economics and the history of economic thought than you do, and especially with respect to the Austrian school. So I thought, well, why don't we have a session on the early Austrians? I think most libertarians are familiar with Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Israel Kirzner and the whole generation of Austrian economists that are our age and people in their 40s and 50s. But I am willing to bet that a lot of people are just unaware of the earliest generation of Austrians, and I'm specifically referring to three people, and that was Carl Menger, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, and Friedrich Wieser. So I thought, well, let's have a session on those early Austrians. So you're going to be carrying the ball, and earning your keep during this particular session, because you're the guy that knows all about this. But I'll just say that, one of the earliest books I read was Menger. Now, I didn't get as much out of Menger as I did Mises, but, at least it helped me to establish a foundation for Austrian economics. And so why don't we start with Menger, and then we'll go on to Böhm-Bawerk and Wieser. Tell us a little bit about Carl Menger, who he was, and what his contribution to Austrian economics was.
Well, it's worth paying attention or marking Carl Menger and his contributions, because last year, 2021, was the 150th anniversary of the publication of his famous book, what in English is just translated as Principles of Economics, in which he laid down what is called the Austrian version of the theory of marginal utility. But before I get to very, very briefly summarizing some of his ideas, let me give a little bio. He was born in 1840 in a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which today is in Poland, the country of Poland. He died in 1921. He was a little over 80 years old. He came from a rather prominent family. He had two brothers who were well-known Austrian academics and scholars and notable figures during their and his lifetime. He graduated from the university, earning a PhD, and then went to work at first as a journalist, an economic or business journalist. It was during this time, according to stories that he would tell, that he started thinking about the foundations of economics. He had to report on the fluctuations in commodity prices and stock market prices. And he was noticing that the way prices were being formed and changing on actual commodity and stock market prices seemed to have very little to do with the established and existing and taken for granted body of economic theory, basically the labor theory of value, which had been prominent among the economics profession of its time, beginning with Adam Smith. The idea that what determines the relative values of goods in terms of each other is the quantity of labor that had gone into each of the goods. So if it takes 2 hours to down a deer while you're hunting in the forest, and if it only takes 1 hour to successfully trap a beaver, then the logical things would be that two beaver would trade for one deer, representing the respective amounts of labor that had gone into their manufacture, if you will. And Menger was concluding that markets have nothing to do with this. The amount of labor quantity, as measured by time in some way, that had gone into the value of commodities, share prices of the stock market, general prices, prices in general for goods and services, for the services of labor in the manufacturing sectors of the economy or farming, had nothing to do with this. And slowly but surely, he came to the notion that basically what determines the value of goods is the subjective or personal evaluation of the user of something. In other words, he asks himself, is this a useful thing for a purpose that I have in mind? And how useful is it? And that led him to the second aspect, is that while value is subjective, we evaluate things at the margin. One of the classical economists had this paradox of value. Adam Smith asked in The Wealth of Nations, doesn't it seem to be an anomaly that something that is so essential to human existence, water, we all have to drink something, water, has a low value in the marketplace? How much does it cost to buy a glass of water, a mug of water? On the other hand, diamonds are a superfluous bauble just for our vanity and amusement. And yet the price of a diamond is far in excess of that glass of water that is essential for our existence. And so that's how led him to this idea of the labor theory of value. That, well, how much effort has to go into just getting a glass of water out of a stream or a river or a lake next to you, as opposed to the mining and the extraction and the jeweler cutting the diamond into its usable forms. Oh, that's a lot of labor. But what Menger said is that this has nothing to do with it. What determines the value of a good is the marginal evaluation of what the good is to you. Now, what does that mean, marginal evaluation? It's asking yourself, well, what is the incremental importance to me if I could acquire one more unit of a good? The example I sometimes use with my students is you walk into your closet and you have shirts, you have pants, you have jackets. And let's suppose that you were deciding, well, could I use when I want one more clothing item? Well, I only have a certain amount of money that I could spend on adding to my wardrobe. At the margin, what additional clothing item would have the greatest significance to me? An additional shirt, an additional pair of pants, an additional jacket, for instance? And you would say at the margin, which has the highest value to me relative to the other uses that I could make with this means at my disposal, a sum of money? And therefore, as your supply of a good increases, at the margin, each additional unit has a lower value to you than a preceding one. So you're ranking things at the margin as they're each diminishing in relative importance to you as your relative amounts of it increase that are available for your uses and purposes. So the value of goods ultimately comes from our judgments as to what we think they're worth to serve our purposes and at the margin. And at the same time, that affects the value of resources, including labor. Labor has value in terms of a price, not because there's a certain amount of time that the labor is used for, but we ask ourselves, well, what is the value of this worker's time relative to the goal or purpose that it could serve? And therefore, we impute back to the labor services the value of the good that could be produced with his working participation. Anyway, so he develops this in his famous book, The Principles of Economics, which, as I said, came out in 1871, just a little over 150 years ago now. And he deals with what is the nature of a good? What is the nature of the relationship between desirable goods and the satisfaction of our wants? How are our wants satisfied as we increase the quantity of goods at our disposal? So the marginal principle. And then from there, he says, well, what determines the prices of goods in exchange? And people find relative opportunities of trading at the margin things that they have more of than they need relative to what they would desire to have, and vice versa for the other person. So therefore, the prices are determined by the marginal evaluations of the buyers and sellers, and therefore between the forces of supply and demand generating the prices. Interestingly enough, Menger in his analysis is less concerned with explaining, well, if you hypothetically had this demand curve and hypothetically had this supply curve, what we're concerned with is X marks the spot where the two curves come together, intersecting, and that's, quote, the equilibrium price. Menger was interested in explaining how people's bids and offers would generate arrangement in which a price would fall, an equilibrium price, but he was more concerned with the dynamism of how our subjective evaluations generate our judgments as to what we think goods are worth, our chosen willingness to make bids and accept offers from others. And out of the process of these subjective individual interactions, prices form. And so he's concerned with the logic of how prices are formed in general, and less important in the specific, well, is that an equilibrium price per se or not? Just to not go on too much about in this context, he explains the nature of competition, how a price is formed if there's two-sided competition, one-sided competition, if there's monopoly on each side, a monopoly seller, a monopoly buyer, and how that affects how prices are formed and where prices might be established. And then finally, in the last chapter of the book, he discusses the origin of money. And this becomes sort of a main concept and contribution that he's usually credited for. And that is, he says, well, where does money come from? He says, money is not the creation of kings through edict or commands or legislative bodies voting to establish a money. Money has evolved naturally out of the interactions of people who find it difficult to reach agreeable terms of trade through direct barter, the buying and selling of one good directly for another. So rather than people leaving the marketplace frustrated, they might very well trade away what they have for something that they don't personally want, but they believe someone else would take and trade if they had it in possession to offer in exchange. And therefore, some goods are now selected and used as media of exchange. I trade my labor services for a sum of money to the Citadel. And then I use that money as the means by which I buy other goods that I want, even though many people in the marketplace might themselves not directly want to trade with me if I had to sell economics lectures to get my groceries from the supermarket or the car from the showroom or to pay my mortgage payment to the mortgage company. So money emerges spontaneously out of the market. And just to quickly just finish with the general theme of him, he wrote one other book, Investigation into the Methods of the Social Sciences and Economics in particular, rather long Germanic type title, which came out in 1883. And this becomes a centerpiece where he says most, if not many, certainly many, and probably most social institutions that we take for granted are not the creations of government, but emerge out of these spontaneous interactions of multitudes of people over time, and are this institutional glue that holds things together: language, custom, tradition, mores, ethics, the rules of social interaction, including the institutions of the marketplace. All of these emerge spontaneously out of the market itself. You don't need government. The government, often, if they attempted to regulate this, would just make it even worse than leaving it alone. And so these were the sort of the areas of contribution that Menger made. Now, he was alone in the Austria of his time. There was very few people interested in his ideas at first, but I'll stop in a second, but to set sort of a segue to what we'll talk about next, two young men who had recently graduated from the University of Vienna, but who had not studied with Menger, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk and Friedrich Wieser, discovered his book. They were students together, they were friends together. In fact, Böhm-Bawerk ended up marrying Wieser's sister. Fortunately, the sister was better looking than Wieser, so I feel good for Böhm-Bawerk. So that, yeah, you can laugh. Okay, yeah. So, but it was through their writings over the next decade or so, inspired by Menger, that made the international notoriety of the Austrian school.
Yeah, that's an interesting exposition of Menger. That I find it fascinating that from the time of that Adam Smith writes his treatise, The Wealth of Nations, all the way through the 1800s. He wrote that book in 1776, and then all through the 1800s, the classical economists, John Stuart Mill, Bentham, Bastiat, that everybody subscribes to this labor theory of value. When in retrospect, it looks so obviously fallacious. And the example that I remember hitting me was that a guy goes and spends, months digging out a really beautiful diamond out of the earth, and then another guy finds an equally valuable diamond cut in the same quality on the ground, top of the ground. So you would think under the labor theory of value that the first diamond is going to be more valuable than the second diamond. Well, not so, because they're the same diamond, same quality diamonds, same value in the marketplace. And so the individuals that came up with the subjective theory of value, and it wasn't just Menger. I mean, there was William Stanley Jevons in England, I believe, and then Valra in Switzerland.
France, but yes.
Simultaneously came up with the same concept, which I find really interesting, but independent of each other.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's go into von Böhm-Bawerk and you already gave us a little bit of a connection there. These two students discover Menger, so take it from there.
Yes. Böhm-Bawerk and Wieser had been studying at the University of Vienna. And when Menger passed away, Wieser wrote, because Böhm-Bawerk died earlier than either one of them. Böhm-Bawerk actually died in 1914. Menger lived, even though 11 years senior to both Böhm-Bawerk and Wieser, died in 1921. And then Wieser himself died in 1927. But Wieser, shortly after Menger passed away, wrote a biographical essay. And it's a very interesting essay. I actually translated it from the German, and it is available on the website of the American Institute for Economic Research. I translated it and it was posted on their website a couple of years ago, I guess. And he explains is that both of them have been interested in understanding economics, even though they were earning law degrees at the University of Vienna. If you wanted to study economics, you did it through the law faculty. And they had turned to the classical economists, and they found it insightful and valuable. Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Jean-Baptiste Say, John Stuart Mill, but they felt that something was lacking, and that when they discovered Menger's book, they felt that this was sort of like an open sesame. That here was a vista that explained the logical foundations of human decision making, the logic by which prices emerge out of competitive processes, the nature of institutions such as money, and this inspired them. So they went off to graduate school together, well, postgraduate school, in Germany, to the University of Heidelberg. And as I said, they eventually became brothers-in-law. Böhm-Bawerk did marry Wieser's sister. And at Heidelberg, each of them started writing things that became the hallmark of their respective contributions. So let me just sort of, again, briefly talk about Böhm-Bawerk's. Böhm-Bawerk, again, I suppose I should explain the biography here. He was born in 1851, so he was about 11 years the junior of Menger himself. And he died in 1914, in the summer of 1914, just shortly after the beginning of the First World War. He ended up teaching at the University of Innsbruck for a number of years, but he got interested in public service in that he went into the Austrian government's Ministry of Finance, and 3 times he served as the Minister of Finance for 2 short stints during caretaker governments. And then the longest term was from 1900 to 1904. And during this 4-year period when he was the finance minister of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what you see is him practicing a balanced budget, low taxes, paying off part of the national debt, and keeping government expenditures on a tight rein. In fact, when the prime minister in whose government he was serving wanted to undertake a Keynesian type public works project of railroad, government subsidized railroad construction to try to stimulate employment and output, Böhm-Bawerk argued against his own prime minister in the meetings that the cabinet had with the Emperor of Austria, Franz Josef, and basically was arguing that even though he's serving in this fellow's government, Your Highness, these are policies that would be financially deleterious and have no economic justification. He was, as one historian puts it, Böhm-Bawerk was the stumbling block, holding back Keynesian-type policies at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, of course, the author is angry at Böhm-Bawerk. Oh, he's the stumbling block. But I like that phrase. He was a stumbling block against the proto-Keynesianism. Anyway, but he finally resigned in 1904, because of what he considered to be irregularities in the defense budget. Basically, he felt that these were corrupt things of certain friends of those in government getting the defense contracts in sort of surreptitious ways. Then he went back to teaching, and he taught at the University of Vienna from 1905 until he died in 1914. What is notable about that time, he ran a famous seminar at the University of Vienna where among the attendees were Ludwig von Mises and Joseph Schumpeter. And this became a rather internationally renowned seminar in generating these type of participants. And both Mises and Schumpeter, even though they ended up having different views about a lot of things, both wrote in glowing and admiring terms of Böhm-Bawerk as a man, his integrity as a finance minister, and his inspiration as a teacher. So what was his contributions after that little bit of a bio? What his original idea was, how would he apply Menger's ideas to the theory of capital and interest? So what he basically did in the theory of interest, he said, well, what determines the formation of interest rates on markets? And he basically argued, this is subjective valuations too, but is a subjective valuation of the value of time. Do you prefer the use of goods closer to the present, or are you willing to forego the use of those goods until sometime in the future if someone offers you a premium on foregoing the use of your own resources over that time horizon? And out of this interaction of a borrower and a lender, evaluating the value of the use of goods in the present versus the future across time in this way, the market rates of interest arise out of a form of time preference. The other element of his is his theory of capital, and that is taking his cue from ideas in Menger's own book about that all production takes time, and that all production invariably has to go through stages of production. The raw materials are mined and extracted out of the ground. They are sent to manufacturing establishments in which the raw materials are put into more refined and usable forms. The iron ore becomes a machine. The machine is installed in a factory. In the factory, with the assistance of the machinery, resources and labor are set to work, and a product gets to begin to be produced. The analogy I like to think of, I think like the conveyor belt at an automobile assembly line. There's the chassis, and then it's passed to the next people, and the drivetrain is added to the chassis on the assembly line. And then the drivetrain and the chassis is passed on to the next people who attach the electricals on the dashboard and so on. And then it's passed to the next group of people where on the assembly line the front and back seats are put in and so on. And then the bumpers and the hood and the windshield, and finally a car comes off the assembly line. All production goes through stages of production over a necessary period of production until goods are available. And von Böhm-Bawerk's idea was that if we want to have more and better final goods and services, it requires us to invest in more and better capital equipment. But that takes time in itself and adds to often the stages of production necessary to complete a product. But that by investing in more productive goods involving the sacrifice of more time, we will not only have more output, but more quality and a wider variety of outputs. So he emphasized this idea of the time element in all production. I should also mention, just as an aside here, around the turn of the century, while he was still serving as a finance minister, he had a debate with a proto-Keynesian. And these articles actually are in English. There was a fellow named Bastido, and Bastido said, well, you know, savings is bad because if people save, then they're not buying. And if they're not buying, businessmen will have no incentive to produce. And if they have no incentive to produce, they don't hire workers. And if they don't hire workers, you have unemployment. So we have to stimulate the aggregate demand for final output. Well, that's a very Keynesian type argument about 30 odd years before John Maynard Keynes wrote his famous book in the 1930s. So Böhm-Bawerk replies to this, and he says here, well, this is totally wrong, because when people save, they're not foregoing consumption forever. It's basically foregoing consumption for a period of time. You put money aside for your retirement or your child's education or to buy the dream home and so on and so forth. So you're saving in the present to increase your production in the future. And it's the task of entrepreneurs in the market in general to anticipate when consumers will want goods and to be investing and producing those goods at the time moments when they'll want them. So savings is not anathema to either employment or the economic health of the society. In fact, savings is essential so the resources are freed up to undertake the capital investments so goods can be available in the varieties, in the quantities, and the qualities at the time moments when they will be wanted in the future when people wish to use their savings to consume more in that later date.
Yeah, before I discovered libertarianism, I was a leftist. I believed that government should be helping the poor. It always shocked me that anybody would object to that. But when I discovered libertarianism in Austrian economics, I realized that, hey, the people on the left never ask, how is it that wealth comes into existence? They just assume it's there. And that let's now confiscate wealth from one group of people and give it to another group of people. And that's the way to solve poverty. I mean, that's the whole war on poverty concept, taking from those who have and giving to those who don't have. But they never ask, how is it that people have in the first place? They just assume that's a given. And it seems to me the great contribution of the Austrians is essentially the title of Adam Smith's book is, what are the causes of the wealth of nations? What is it that causes wealth to come into existence? And it's really savings that does that, Richard, that people save and they put their money in a bank. A farmer will come and say, hey, I want to borrow money to buy a tractor. And the banker says, well, I just happen to have the money. A bunch of people came in here and put their savings. Here's money to go buy a tractor. And so with the tractor, the farmers and workers are now producing 10,000 bushels of wheat instead of 1,000 bushels. And that means the farmer's wealthier, but he also means he has more money to pay those workers. And also there's more products out in the market for people to buy. And if people would just come to that realization that there really is a key to ending poverty or drastically reducing poverty, and that's a free market society where people are free to do whatever they want with their money, but normally they would save it given the right incentives, that would be the key to doing that. And
Yes.
Was that set forth then in Böhm-Bawerk's book as a foundation to this?
Yes. The basis of wealth creation is savings and investment. And that requires a sacrifice of the uses of your resources in the present so they can be set aside for a period of time to make those more and better capital goods that will facilitate you making not only more goods, but better quality and a greater variety of goods in the future, which itself is that example of a rising standard of living. Okay,
we're about out of time. Did you want to make any parting comments about Wieser?
Yeah, let me do it very quickly. Like I said, Wieser was at school with Böhm-Bawerk They went off to this postgraduate study at the University of Heidelberg. What Wieser was interested in analyzing and became a keynote of his work was what determines the value of the factors of production. And his particular contribution was, again, that it is not the labor that goes into something, but is what he came to call the alternative value that is foregone, that determines what something, the cost of something. Though he doesn't coin the term, it was called Wieser's law for a long time. And it's basically the concept of opportunity cost. What is the value of the resources that go into the making of the microphone that you have there in front of you on your desk, Jacob? Well, the value of those resources is reflected in the next best alternatives for which they could have been applied. The resources, the machinery, the labor time, the labor effort that could have been used to make something else other than the microphone that's right in front of you. So what is the real cost of making anything? It is the value of those resources, the value of the means in the pursuit of an alternative end. So that for that microphone to be manufactured, the producers of it had to decide that you were willing to pay a price just sufficiently high enough to make it attractive to draw those resources and labor and capital machinery away from some alternative product and the subjective value of what that other product would have been worth. That became his major contribution. He also was a rather interesting sociologist, which we don't have time to get into. His last book, which came out a year before he died, was called The Law of Power. And he also wrote an entire treatise on economics called Social Economics. I should just mention, whereas both Menger and Böhm-Bawerk would rightly be considered generally classical liberals, advocates of a very relatively limited government, emphasizing free market competition, the autonomy of the marketplace, the importance of individual entrepreneurial innovation and creativity and autonomy. Wieser was a bit more of a Fabian socialist. If you read his treatise on economics, social economy, you find him willing to concede of a wide variety of roles of government that neither Menger nor Böhm-Bawerk would have agreed with in general. But their contributions have formed the core not only of the rest of the history of the Austrian school, but in fact has influenced all economists in one way or another. In fact, just to end this, in 1903, a famous American sociologist, Albion Small, came to Austria to have a conversation with Menger. And that was about the time Menger was retiring from teaching. And Menger said, interestingly enough, that he did not care. He did not care if the name Austrian school survived, because in his mind, the core of his contributions had more or less been accepted: marginal utility, subjective value, how prices are formed in the market. All the basic core concepts that he had tried to develop had been more or less accepted by the vast majority of professional and serious economists. Now, of course, he was wrong about that, because a lot of Austrian ideas ended up not being accepted. And there is still an Austrian school. But Menger felt that that was the significance of his contribution, that he had influenced economic thinking as a whole.
Okay, fascinating. Then from out of these three guys comes Ludwig von Mises.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Who is this, Richard?
Ellington. This is Duke Ellington.
Duke Ellington. Good boy, Duke. Duke, you're a star. You're on the internet.
Exactly. Okay.
All right, Richard. On that fine, eloquent note by you and Duke, we'll wrap things up. And greatly enjoyed. Fascinating conversation. Thanks for imparting your wisdom with us. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And if you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to all our stuff. And Richard, look forward to seeing you next week. And I look forward to seeing our viewers next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.